Thank you to the ASBMB for this extraordinary honor, and thank you to the colleagues who nominated me for this award, people who have walked beside me both in science and in life. This award bears the name of Ruth Kirschstein, a scientist who believed deeply that access and excellence were not competing values. They were mutually reinforcing. That idea that excellence expands when access expands has shaped my journey. And so today I want to tell you about my story, one about its roots, opportunity, scientific impact, and the road to responsibility. And I want to anchor this simple truth in this statement. Talent is universal, but access is not. I come from Lynchburg, Roanoke, and Virginia Beach, Virginia. Communities shaped by segregation and resilience. My grandparents were descendants of enslaved people, and my parents navigated the transition from segregated to integrated schools. But education was a liberation within my family. My mom was one of the first Black women to be accepted to the College of William and Mary. Her twin siblings, my uncles Faye and Ray, were products of HBCUs, Virginia State, and Johnson C. Smith. And my dad went on to play Division I football at Glenville State College. Education was really this a liberation for our family. However, there were no scientists amongst that group. While many of my family members went into education, everything from elementary school to high school, and one was even a middle school science teacher, biomedical research was unknown to us. It was really invisible. There were no scientists in my family, no research mentors or lab tours. So talent existed, but access did not. As a chemistry major and Division I softball player at Radford University, I know there are several faculty members and undergraduates from Radford here today. My time was spent at 6 a.m. workouts, class time, afternoon practices, traveling across the country to play the game that I loved and the reason why I picked Radford. So that meant there was no time for research for me. So I was really inspired by an advisor there that prompted me to think about going to do research at an institution. That prompted me to go to UNC Chapel Hill to do the summer undergraduate internship. And that exposure really changed everything for me. Access ignited my trajectory, and so I was able to walk into the doors of Dr. Channing Tur's lab, not knowing how to hold a pipette at all, and not understanding RAS biology. And so many of you of the cancer biologists in this room know that 40 years ago, Channing made the seminal discovery that RAS was actually an oncogene and then it was mutated in human tumors. Well, I didn't know any of that. But I was surrounded by excellence, and excellence is contagious. That summer became a Ph.D. in RAS signaling for me, and accessing and trying to understand how RAS small GTPases and Rho GTPases actually contribute to tumor biology in Adrian Cox's lab. I then went really far, 10 miles down the road to pursue my postdoctoral fellowship, trying to understand still how RAS signals. And so we identified its contributions to mitochondrial metabolism and segregation. And then we also uncovered that the MAP kinases, MEK1 and 2, we just heard a beautiful talk from Roger about some of these kinases, actually require copper for their activity. And so this landed and seemed to be really important in the context of BRAF mutant melanomas, and launched my independent career at Penn. We now also focus on how metal nutrients contribute to tumor biology and utilize chemical biology tools to do this. But really that access is what led to my own excellence and what laid down the foundation for responsibility. So in 2020, we were living through twin crises, right? A global pandemic and a national reckoning around structural inequity, focused on race, justice, and structural inequity. Those crises exposed fault lines in academic medicine. At that moment, I was on my way to being promoted and tenured as a presidential associate professor at Penn. one of 2 Black women that actually hold that title in a basic science department. And so visibility was not really the goal, but I really found it to be a responsibility. And I found myself asking, if talent is universal but access is not, what responsibility do we have at institutions to shape this? This was not about statements. This wasn't about optics. It was about finding a structure and systems that actually matter. And at Penn, that framework was actually started and embedded in our institutional priorities that were launched by then President Amy Gutmann, who went on to be the US ambassador to Germany under the Biden administration. And those were innovation, impact, and inclusion. Now for us, innovation was not just about the discoveries that happened in the laboratory, but in how we design environments where discovery happens. Impact was about ensuring that our work affects not only journals, but the communities in our surrounding areas and broadly, nationally. And inclusion was recognizing that the promise of the next generation of leaders actually requires intentional structures that expand access and mentorship. They are not separate pillars, they are really interdependent of one another. So when I was tapped by our Chief Scientific Officer and Executive Vice Dean at the time to create and envision the Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Learner and Research Office at the University of Pennsylvania, I don't know what, oh, okay. I took that on as a challenge to think about how we could do this type of work. Did it, oh, I don't know what that happened. I didn't do that, at least. But you can see my notes. I don't know how that changed. Yeah, they're controlling it. Hold on a second. Display settings, do I need it? I can't click. The lights are so bright. Swap. They're fixing it, I think. Oh, relaunching. So, okay. Okay, I'll click through quickly. Okay, so we wanted to launch this office called Ideal Research. And at that moment, we wanted to build it to be sustainable. It wasn't just going to be an initiative, but we wanted to have really built-in structures for efficiency. And so we centered this around 3 particular domains. Structured pathways to persistence, so these are our pipeline programs that I know many of our institutions have. We also wanted to focus on cultural transformation, how we actually support and scaffold the needs of the trainees in our vast ecosystem. And we wanted to redefine excellence by thinking about our selection processes, because access without continuity does not produce scientists. Culture without clarity does not retain them. And selection without defined criteria does not scale that excellence. And so when we think about our structured pathways to persistence at Penn, for decades we talked about these types of pipelines. We employ those flows. We know that it's not just about support, but it's really more important to be aligned with the institutional goals and their underlying commitment. So through SYP over the last 5 years, we've been able to double the size of that program by going out to the partners in our communities, the departments, institutes, and centers to increase the support for those programs. We've also been able to increase the number of scholars by 2 times in our post-baccalaureate program. But that's not the only thing that was important for us. You can bring people in, but how do you keep them in your pipeline? So we envision a structural innovation that was built on alignment. We created this early consideration pathway that converted exposure into institutional commitment. The difference between apply and hope that you'll get into a program instead of thinking about apply and persist within that program. We did not want it to think about it as a funnel, but we wanted to reduce the bottleneck to being in our PhD programs. And so what this really looked like was that students that excelled within our summer undergraduate internship program or a post-baccalaureate program were able to apply to our graduate programs early if they excelled during their time at Penn. They apply in October. They interview in November, and they know that they're into our program prior to that December 1st deadline when all of us are getting our, for us this year, 4,500 applications to biomedical graduate studies at Penn. And what this actually provides is students have already had an exposure to the University of Pennsylvania. They know what we're about, and that brings them back to Penn. It's very similar to my story of wanting to go back to UNC Chapel Hill to pharmacology. What that leads to is enhanced matriculation rates. As you can see here, 90% of those students that we identify in our undergraduate program or our post-bac program actually matriculate to Penn to do their PhDs. While in the traditional pool, we have about a 60% matriculation rate. And these rates, when every single one of our programs is guessing about whether or not a student is going to come to the institution, we have a pretty high rate of success from our programs. The next thing we wanted to do is think about recruitment. Now, recruitment is only the beginning to how we enable access. And by definition, recruitment is episodic, right? It happens in a season, a cycle, a moment. But persistence is daily. And in the environment in which our trainees find themselves in is what determines their persistence. As a baseball fan and former softball player, there's a line from the Field of Dreams, right? If you build it, they will come. In academic medicine, that's not quite true. It depends on what you actually build around them in terms of scaffolding. And so, as you can see here in this diagram, we have our different pipelines that are coming into the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, but what we wanted to do was provide a lot of scaffolding around them. We've initiated a mentoring training initiative. That means that mentoring is not just thought about as something that might happen in every single one of our laboratories, but instead a skill set that each one of our PIs can have. We wanted to demystify that hidden curriculum for our trainees from untraditional backgrounds. We partner with an office on campus called Restorative Practices to deal with conflicts when they arise. We advocate for those trainees that know to overcome barriers. Every single one of our members of our community undergoes mental health awareness. And we've built in near-peer networks. And that's in the form of our Ideal Research Fellows. These are graduate students and postdocs in the community that we actually compensate that contribute to our overall mission. And that allows us to have a broader connection to the community and understand their needs. Of course, this is when the pivot happened, right? We had started to build these ways to align entry into our programs. We had thought about how to retain people within our programs, and then we needed a pivot. 2025 was hard. Then the stress test came really for what we had built. Supreme Court decisions, executive orders, federal funding volatility, shifts in institutional research priorities, and just overall institutional uncertainty in terms of resources. Across the country, programs were paused. Some were dismantled entirely, and I'm sorry if that happened at your institution. At Penn, Ideal Research was renamed as Research Training Affairs to get rid of inclusion, diversity, and equity in that name. So the label changed, but the priorities didn't. And why was that the case? Why were we able to sustain that? It's because we had built a blueprint based on a really strong foundation. We were thinking about how we reviewed every single one of our applications and access for all. We had a transparent levels of criteria to evaluate each one of those applications. And we were really aligned with the institutional priorities. We were aligned with that inclusion, innovation, and impact that makes Penn special. And so that allowed us to take that blueprint that we created in 2021 and really come to building it into a building or a really nice infrastructure in what we have now in Research Training Affairs. So what did this really look like at the selection level? Let me turn to what I think is maybe the hardest part to think about for every single one of us. And so before I talk about the rubrics that we built that help us to define and redefine excellence, I want to talk about how we were inspired to do this. This shift did not begin as compliance, right, which was the most important part of the 2025 journey. At Penn, I was really shaped by three thought leaders from the Wharton School of Business, our Graduate School of Education, and the School of Arts and Sciences. Adam Grant, that maybe some of you know about Think Again or Hidden Potential, really has done some pioneering work that helps us to establish that potential is actually developed, right? It's not detected in any one of our systems. Angela Duckworth has published really beautiful work on grit that shows that persistence of short-term goals really turns into long-term gains. And so that effort over time really predicts capacity. And then third, Damani White-Lewis, who's a new faculty member in our Graduate School of Education, has really thought cleverly about defining criteria that helps us protect the rigor of every single one of our processes. So when you want to define excellence in a particular way, it does not come down to whether or not that candidate is excellent and really belongs. And so how did we do this? We thought about character attributes for every single one of the applicants to one of our programs, and they were built around initiative, effort, collaboration, and persistence. And we wanted to evaluate each one of these candidates on their demonstrated mastery, so their research achievement and their scholarly achievement, through an equity-minded, holistic review of those applications. Now, I want to talk a little bit for a second about equity-minded holistic review. Holistic does not mean vague. Holistic means multi-dimensional. We evaluated demonstrated mastery, sustained effort, applied capability, and collective contribution, and how they were going to show up and contribute to the Penn community. And we assessed these character traits as part of that. Now, these aren't personality traits, but are predictors of sustained success and scientific discovery within our systems. We trained every single one of our reviewers. We clarified the overall expectations for what we were looking for, and we made standards very transparent. Rubrics do not lower their standards. I think sometimes that's what bubbles up in rooms and conversations. And so something important really happened. We were able to increase the rigor of our process. You felt more confident about the candidates that you were selecting. It clarified any of the issues that were happening before, and this allowed us to increase representation more broadly. And so when excellence is really undefined, prestige fills that gap. When excellence is defined, opportunity expands. And when transparency happens, we are able to protect the rigor of every single one of our processes. And so what have we built? And Kristen talks about this in the introduction. We've been able to build a sustainable program to increase access at the University of Pennsylvania. We did this by aligning our entry points from any one of our pathway programs with our institutional goals and our institutional commitment to increasing access and enabling excellence. We did this through cultural change by changing the ways in which we show up for every single trainee on our campus and helping them to thrive within our environment. And we refined our selection processes such that they were allowed us to pick the best and next best scholars. Now, I'm sure some of you have seen these data from Kenny Gibbs's infamous eLife paper from 2016. I want to talk about this for a second, because as we've increased our pipeline programs over the last few decades, that has really increased the number of Ph.D.s that are from underrepresented minority groups. However, when we look at that transition to those that are entering the pipeline as assistant professors, that has not been the case, right? We see a 2.6x increase in assistant professors, while we have this 9.3 increase in PhD trainees. And so this lapse in that transition period suggests that there's not really a supply problem, but there's a system problem. Growth without design does not scale representation, and if we want structural changes, we must redesign our transition points. So we've thought about this over the last few years in the Department of Cancer Biology at Penn, where we've really thought about what is really the problem in our processes when we get hundreds of applications into our faculty positions. We typically utilize signals of prestige and excellence to make our selections. And so when those criteria are really unclear, they're ambiguous, Reputation really fills that gap. And so our aim was to define excellence by rigor, vision, and broad contributions of each one of our candidates. And so what this meant is when we designed our new process, a lot of this was informed by conversations with the Yale molecular biophysics and biochemistry departments, and conversations with Enrique de la Cruz and Wendy Gilbert. We wanted to think about evidence before identity, criteria before prestige, and broadening who could compete within our searches. So we anonymized the entire process. Something that Blanton Tolbert, who's now my colleague at Penn, and I like to think about for this is that this is an in vitro selection experiment, right? So we designed it to be blind to prestige and guided by our rubric clarity. Within phase 1, in phase 2, we were looking at research achievement, creativity, vision, and fit, and cultural excellence. How are they going to mentor? How are they going to teach and maybe contribute to inclusion and equity at Penn? We anonymized these statements, and we looked at past and future research, collaboration and collegiality, and commitment to inclusion and equity. And that was our first phase 1 screening. 50% of the applicant pool was cut at that particular point without knowing who their mentor was, what institution they were at, or where they had published their work. We then deep-blinded ourselves and looked at the cover letters, CVs, resumes, and letters of recommendation. We brought 10 candidates to campus, and 30% of them happened to be from underrepresented groups in science. And so it worked. We had the evidence that maybe something like this could happen. So I want to leave you when thinking about my journey. Someone who has experienced the importance of opening doors to a laboratory that I didn't even know existed, where access was required for my trajectory, and that trajectory produced my excellence. And excellence then led to my responsibility to contribute to these things, both at Penn and more broadly. And so I want to leave you with 3 ideas. We do not widen participation by chance. It needs intention. When excellence is intentional, representation can be scaled to the masses. And the future of science depends on what we choose to build. So think thoughtfully about what you build at each institution. And then finally, that question is not who belongs in science, but what systems we build and whether or not they're worthy of those participants. And so with that, I'd like to thank the people who have been part of my journey from Radford University to the University of Pennsylvania, my mentors, my colleagues. Especially like to thank Kristen, George, Dan Kessler, and Bill Clemens for their nomination for this award, Tracy Johnson, who gave me feedback on this presentation, and of course my broad family, the Brady bunch that I, of course, affectionately call it, and then my friends and colleagues across the country. We get to see each other at many of these meetings, including ASBMB and Abercams, and so this picture at the bottom right is really important to me. It's a group of people that I lean on for support all the time, and so I'm thankful for many of them that are here in the audience today, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.